So my name is Sarah Dunn Phillips. I'm the Assistant Director for Education Initiatives at Margolis. And we'll kind of get a little started. And so, in session one, and just kind of going back to our roadmap that we talked about, what these two sessions will cover, is that, we started with assessing our leadership styles and then learning about leadership and, how to lead diverse teams. Tonight is going to focus more on cross-cultural leadership, and as well as I'm going to introduce you to a tool that can help you with cross-cultural leadership in the future. And then kind of post-session, you have your own individual homework that no one's ever going to test you on, but it's always good to evaluate how you show up as a leader as you enter new spaces or after you've been in a new space for a little bit of time. And then also like reanalyzing your leadership style. So hopefully this quiz will give you something to come back to over time to kind of just help you see like, okay, well, when I'm in student mode, and I'm in a student space, this is how I'm showing up. And when I'm in the workspace, this is how I'm showing up, right? And it can give you, by having a sense of that leadership style, I can give you a sense of some tips and tools and how you communicate with people. And if you don't like how you're showing up, it also gives you the opportunity to change it, right? So if you find out that you're being more, you're having more of an authoritative leadership style, and I personally identify with being much more like a communicative leader or a collaborative leader, then these kind of quizzes will help you kind of navigate that space along the way. Okay. So today I'm just going to talk through the agenda. So we're going to define cross-cultural leadership. We're going to review the cross-cultural kaleidoscope, and then we're going to do an activity, and it's not going to be by leadership style. We're going to put you in your pods because we figured that's another way that you all can have a chance to bond in that space and talk a little bit more freely. And then we're going to have a debrief and we'll talk through some next steps. So we do have some key goals, right, for today. So we want to make sure that you walk away with an understanding of cross-cultural leadership and also intercultural communication theory, as well as the cross-cultural kaleidoscope that I mentioned. So we also are going to do a little bit of reflection in terms of and self-assessment of our leadership styles and that are influenced by our cultural background. So thinking about the quiz results and how maybe your cultural background has played a role into that. I apologize, my puppies are literally dropping things down the stairs right behind me. So can you all hear that echoing, or is it just me? You can hear it? A little bit. Okay, so I'm going to pause for 1 second and let them up here so they stop dropping things down the stairs. So just apologies, 1 second. Enough, guys. Come on. Sorry about that. They tend to be a little rambunctious when they're separated from me at night. Okay, so and then we're gonna discover new ways to kind of lead in multicultural environments, and a lot of that's gonna come from talking to each other and just learning about things that have worked for us in the past, right? So similarly to before, we're gonna kind of ask some quiz questions along the way, not necessarily to gain your knowledge, but to build, to basically build a shared understanding and just have some engagement along the way. So if you could, and if you just go to slido.com and then you just type in the code, which is SSL2, then that'll take you into our session. And I'd recommend maybe doing that on your cell phone. We'll be doing the feedback survey this way, and I'll be prompting you along the way to take a look at those. Okay. All right, so we already did introductions to folks who weren't here last time. And so now I want to talk a little bit more about cross-cultural leadership and intercultural communications. So as we all know, the world and its institutions are extraordinarily complex. And so they require us to avoid binary decisions and this kind of black and white thinking that emerges from like unconscious bias, and it leads to stereotyping, right? So in a professional relationship, it's really important to hold space for conflicting values and beliefs, in the sense that like opposing viewpoints can be powerful in eliciting both a both and perspective, one that has the potential to encourage creativity and motivation of thought in multicultural teams and in global organizations, right? So when we're thinking about cross-cultural leadership, intercultural communications, it has emerged, these two concepts have emerged as a way to help individuals and organizations achieve this, right? So this way of avoiding this black and white thinking. So in many ways, you can't really be effective at one without being effective at the other, right? And so, for example, intercultural communication attempts to understand how individuals of different cultures interact with one another, right? And so cross-cultural leadership has developed to understand those leaders who are working in those types of environments where there's multicultural. So whether that's globalized markets, it's an international NGO, you name it, anywhere where there's like, a diversity of people. So today's multicultural workspace and these international organizations require leaders who can adjust to these different environments really quickly and work with partners and employees of other cultures. So to think about that, like, what are the elements that you're trying to think about when it comes to cross-cultural leadership? So the typical like elements per se is that the leader is going to have vision, right? They're also going to have vision for the project, vision for the mission of the organization, or just a vision for their purpose for working with that particular client, or that like local office or whatever, right? So then they also kind of have foresight. So thinking about, their ability to kind of not necessarily predict the future, but kind of look into the future and better understand and be able to predict a little bit like how things are going to be perceived. So if you don't have this, concept of foresight, so like if you're like one kind of example I can give you is that if you're preparing for a presentation, it's basically like knowing your audience, right? Knowing what information is going to be key to those folks who are in the room. So then also things like providing encouragement, not only showing trustworthiness, but also being trustworthy, right? So trust is very difficult to build in cross-cultural environments, and not all countries kind of trust the same, and we'll get into a little bit more, or cultures trust the same way that maybe Americans do or Europeans. And so thinking about that, there's also this concept of, dynamicism and just being able to be flexible and engaging, and then also being positive and proactive, right? So these are kind of the core elements of what a cross-cultural leader is able to bring to the table. And then when you want to think about, well, as I talked about earlier, the two concepts are merged together, right? So thinking about what are some elements of intercultural communications, and I think the key thing there is to remember is that culture is shared, right? It's also transmitted from generation to generation. It's based on symbols, and it's learned, and it's dynamic, right? So it's evolving, it's changing, it's moving and shifting, and different generations within that culture are going to feel differently about different things. And so just the key element is of intercultural communications is to actually be able to fully understand these concepts around culture, right? And so we'll talk about how to put that into practice in the next slide. So when we're thinking about, so we need to understand the cultural norms of the people that we're working with, right? So in the context in which they work and the people that they work with. So it's essential for leaders today to have the skills to increase awareness, their awareness in the professional environment. And so, yet we tend to bracket this awareness so that we enter into any opportunity from an unbiased perspective, right? So where we may have some background information about that culture, we're not assuming that what we've learned is true until we've experienced it, right? So it's kind of removing that bias. And this requires holding opposing values at bay. So you're kind of trying to stay in this neutral space that is characterized by like the suspending of judgments, right? So you're just, there's a lot of openness that happens or that needs to happen as we kind of create this cultural awareness of a particular environment. And so we also need to increase the ability to deal with clients and colleagues from different cultures, as there are fundamental differences around the world in how we think about ourselves. So a person tending to construe himself or herself as an individual, independent individual, or as an interdependent member of a group is culturally bound, right? So studies, for example, like studies show that the Western concept of self is thought of as autonomous, as independent, individualistic, where as the Eastern self concept is collective and interdependent. And so this means that the goals will be viewed differently, right? So we need to be cognitively aware of how those goals or challenges or whatever we're presenting to that those team members, that it's going to be perceived in a way that actually makes sense and helps them to identify with it, right? And then, sorry, I need to scroll on some of my outline here. But and then we also need to understand how diversity contributes to the achievement of better results. And it's important to co-design what those results will be. And one of the many reasons for misunderstandings across cultures is the false assumption that we're all the same. While unity is an admirable ambition, it's probably an impossible one. And I know that's not always what everybody wants to hear. But we're not all the same. And conversely, we're different. We are all different. And yet there are characteristics and tendencies shared by cultural groups that are exhibited by their norms, right? So we need to be respectful of what those norms are. And moreover, although we might be striving for universal concepts such as happiness, right? How we wish to achieve it differs in different cultures, right? So not only that, but there are different rules for the expression and concepts that are thought to have universal meaning, like happiness again. So for example, smiling is not trusted in some cultures, right? So this sometimes perceived as this happy-go-lucky American bubbly smiling personality is no, that's not always trusted in other places. This laid-back feeling, it can make people very suspicious. And so you have to then think to yourself, how are you challenging your own assumptions, right? Like when you're in a multicultural space, to just give yourself the opportunity to connect with people and not create barriers for yourself in these environments. So along the way, that means that we've got to learn some strategies and techniques to communicate effectively in dynamic and often challenging environments, right? Which brings me to the tool that I mentioned earlier, which is the cross-cultural kaleidoscope. Thank you. Sorry. While you all are in breakout rooms in a few minutes, I'm going to be having dinner, so I apologize. That's Bailey. Thank you, dear. So perfect timing, actually. Okay, so this is going to take a little bit to get through. Can everybody see this visual pretty well? Is it clear? Okay. So we need to think about the external influences, as we kind of step into talking about this tool. it's helpful if you think about the external influences that have impacted you over your lifespan. And then as we kind of talk through it, contemplating a little bit about those that have contributed to your sense of identity. And when we get to the breakout rooms, you'll have a little bit more time to do this, like individually and collectively as a group. But it's helpful if you can just think just about one thing that has kind of impacted you as we talk through this. So too often we tend to think of culture as being something exhibited by everyone from the same collective, such as an entire country. And then this leads to stereotyping and bias. And we can see this playing out in our current election, right? Democrats believe X, right? Like, this generalization that all Democrats believe in gun control and they're going to get rid of all the guns, right? That's a misunderstood identity of what all Democrats may believe, right? And the same thing with the Republicans. Republicans believe in strict fiscal policy and blah, 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 right? So we have these kind of, and there's perceptions around the world that, we're these narrow thinkers, right? And it's not intentional, right? But this tends to happen, that we tend to stereotype over time. And the media kind of helps with that, right? So what we need to think about is that there are actually many outside influences that kind of influence our cultural self, right? So that includes our communities, our economic systems, education, politics, the legal system, religious, like spiritual beliefs, even the climate contributes to our cultural sense of self. So for example, my wife, who you just met, she was born in rural Eastern North Carolina, and we talk about, and I'm from Washington, D.C. And so if I don't hear fire trucks and people talking at all hours of the night and just general noise, it's sometimes hard for me to sleep. Whereas she feels completely not herself in the city, and she needs space away from her neighbors and away from people, right? So even environmentally, just from being from a different part of the US, we just have this very different perspectives about how we feel in certain types of spaces. Now, when I go out into the rural area, I just think I'm scared to death because I'm like looking for deer to pop out if I'm driving. I have no idea who's around that big bush that is so dense you can't see through. I just find it like I get paranoid. I don't do well in her neck of the woods, so to speak. So for example, like if you grew up and strongly influenced by the history of your country or your hometown, you've got to think about how does that affect your relationship with your current home, right? Like, and other subtle influences that have come from your environment or your education, right? So for example, if you were educated in a system characterized by rote learning, you may not be as assertive in the workplace as someone who was educated to self-disclose, right? So how would it be for you if you were to contemplate your own cultural influences as distinct from anyone else's? And so ultimately, it is only once we have done the necessary work on ourselves that we are truly ready to begin to work with people from different cultural backgrounds. And so Jennifer Pleistersten at the Institute of Leadership and Management developed the CrossCultural Kaleidoscope, which takes a systems approach. It was actually designed for coaching and mentorship in order to identify the influences that combine to shape a person's cultural identity and a concept that has been officially named the cultural self. So it has been researched using this phenomenological approach, and is concerned with meaning making, right? So the kaleidoscope provides both a basis for exploring at the macro and the micro level, and the impact of past life experiences on an individual. So how you can utilize this, we'll talk in a minute a little bit about how you can utilize this this framework when you're working with people that you're coaching or trying to collaborate with. We'll talk through like how that can actually play out in real life in just a second. But these experiences, so when we're thinking about, so when you're taking a look at this from the either macro, micro, or level and the impact of individual experience, these experiences include the community, they include the cultural societal norms, diversity, economics, history, so as well as the geography, to bring the outside in, right? So it takes this holistic approach of, okay, here's all the components that build the cultural self. We need to bring that into the situation to better understand that individual person that we're working with, right? And then it identifies how these influences can change, or perhaps could change across an individual's lifespan. So for now, we're gonna move on to the breakout rooms if Richa is ready. So what I'd like for you all to do is for each person to share an aspect of their cultural background that you feel comfortable sharing with the group, right? So what state or country, it could be something like, state or country that you're from or grew up in. You can talk about your gender, or ethnicity, or race, religion. And I want you to think about and talk about how it's influenced your leadership style in different situations, right? And so as you all are talking to one another and listening to the aspects of the story, I want you to have, and I'll keep the cultural kaleidoscope up on the screen, but I want you all to think about how their story is reflected in that kaleidoscope, right? So when you start hearing them talk about the diversity of the neighborhood that they grew up in, where does that play a role? Well, that's diversity, but that's also environment, and that's also this, right? So you start to get this web starts getting to be created of the background of this individual through just one simple story that will mostly be very dynamic in how you're thinking about things. And then I want you all to discuss how your background and leadership style could affect your ability to collaborate with those who are different than you, right? So once everyone's had a chance to share, kind of debrief like your story and your leadership style, and think about, what are some of the things you all need to be considerate of, right? As you kind of move along the path. So it is 7:25 now, and I definitely want you all to end on time because you all are just finishing classes and things like that. So why don't we plan to come back at, I'm going to say in 25 minutes. Does that sound good to everyone? So that's going to, I'm struggling to add at this point of the night. So sorry, that is 7:50, correct? I think my math is correct. Okay, so I'll have Richa bring you back at 7:50, but and I will leave this up on the screen, and in a few minutes I will flip back over to this kaleidoscope so you have it. You can also Google the kaleidoscope. You'll find lots of images. There'll be lots there in case you're struggling to look at my screen. Sound good? Okay, we'll see you back here in a few minutes. All right, so I want to spend a little bit of time just hearing from you all. What did you all learn about each other? In the sense of, are there ways that were similar or different? And kind of what did you learn about your leadership and communication style as we're thinking about these multicultural events? And this is just an open discussion. So who wants to get us started?
I think it's Lizbel. I think something that came up in our in our group a lot was that a lot of our cultural backgrounds and experiences had maybe led us to, at one point or another, feel silenced in certain spaces. either because of cultures that we come from backgrounds with require more respect, or racial kind of reasons. And so I think we all kind of realized that that has an impact in our leadership style and how we communicate within teams.
Mm-hmm. So tell me a little bit more. How do you feel like it's impacting your leadership and communication style?
Yeah. So for me personally, like just coming from a Latinx background, it's a lot of like my upbringing was like, oh, don't be like a pest, don't like bother. And so I found that like with a lot of like team stuff and different things that I do now, like it does require like a certain level of follow-up with people and like reminding people maybe another second time or third time about something. And so I know for me, my first instinct is to like, oh, don't bother that person,
Mm-hmm.
past a certain time or past a certain number of times.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know that's been something that I've had to kind of just like push to the side and understand that that's just kind of comes with the territory.
Yeah. Who else can relate to that or something similar?
Just kind of like to piggyback off of that, everyone in my group had a pretty different like background, but something that was a commonality for everyone was just kind of authority figures and just kind of being taught to not question authority, whether it was from being like a culture of respect, or because maybe you grew up in a place where you're just because of the way that you looked, you often weren't allowed to question authority. And I think that we talked about a bit how that manifests itself in leadership styles and how we could avoid that. And something that I thought was good, and I know that we talked about this last session, but some people mentioned this last session, was just kind of being sure that when we are leading a team that we don't make it feel like we are an authority necessarily or above anyone, but rather making sure that we create space for everyone and ensure that everyone feels safe speaking and speaking up for themselves and sharing their ideas.
Oh, that's great. Who else? Okay. So kind of, this is a really big topic, right? Cross-cultural communications, cross-cultural leadership, intercultural communications. It's a lot, and it's a lot to unpack. And in an hour, you can only scratch the surface, right? And so in terms of follow-up, so I'm going to send you the paper that that this, the cross-cultural kaleidoscope was built around, and kind of the academic research behind it, just so that you have it aware, because I think you have it and are aware of it, and it'll help you to use it as a tool, because it talks about things like your leadership styles and how to maybe address that in your, address your communication style when you're working with people of different cultures, right? So it starts to really dig deep into the different styles and different ways of thinking and different kind of tools and tips that like if we had 3 hours we could do in an in-person workshop, but just not enough time to do here in this space, and to really leave you with something that can kind of just help you move into that next space where like you are able to take this to the next level a little bit, this general background foundational information, and try to start to apply some of it in your thinking and as you're kind of moving forward. So let's see. Apologies, I've got too many screens up. So in terms of other next steps, I'm going to share some additional like slides and links for you. And you're going to have the slides and links for both sessions now that this is over. So that way everybody has access to my notes and feedback. And so I also have all of my notes and resources in each slide. So that way if you ever want to cross-reference any of my information or dig deeper, you can just kind of keep going down the rabbit holes as you see fit as it relates to leadership and cross-cultural communications. And so And then at the end of each presentation, there's a set of like specific resources related to the topic. So I'll have Richa send around this as a PDF, as well as that paper that I just mentioned. But if it's okay with you all, I thank you all for your time. I would love to get your feedback, and I have just a quick survey that goes through Slido. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna kick us over to there. So if you go to Slido, you should be able to see it. And we'll, let's see, should be able to fill it out. I'm going to actually go to Slido itself because I don't see that it's popping up. I don't see any. And I'm going to, yes. All right, so hold on one second. I'm going to share a different screen with you all. You should be able to do this all on your phones. But one second, share screen. And this does give live results, so I hope you all don't mind. Okay, can everybody see? Okay. All right, so. So there's about 20 of you on here, and this little ticker is telling me how many people have responded. So if we can get to, 10 or 15 folks, that would be great. Give you all a few more minutes. Great. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next question. And so it looks like it's letting you all go at your own pace, which is great. Last time it wouldn't let me do that. And then going. And then if you've learned anything new, got anything to add there, and then some ways to improve. So I'm gonna leave that poll active for a few minutes to give you all a chance to finish your thoughts. But this is the first time that we've done this leadership series, so I really appreciate both of your feedbacks from the first session and for this one. We will definitely take it into consideration as we plan things for like the future, and we'll also I'll go ahead and send you this creates a report for me. So when I send out those other two pieces of information, I'll also send it to you, because in the first session we were able to kind of co-construct what are some of the attributes that a leader is going to need in the future, and that way you all have those kind of the answers to those things all in one place, okay, as a comprehensive package. So thank you all so much for your time. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm happy to connect offline, but I hope you guys have a good night.